All right, thanks, Gary. This is a real treat for me tonight. I expect everyone in the audience to be here with Matthew Bishop to discuss The Road from Ruin. Matthew is the U.S. business editor and the New York bureau chief of The Economist, and was previously the magazine's London-based business editor. He is the author, also with Michael Green, of Capitalism, a book I think familiar to many in this room tonight, on a global revolution underway in philanthropy. I would note he has also been a business school faculty member, surely high praise. And tonight, we turn to The Road from Ruin. The Road from Ruin, which, again, Matthew wrote with Michael Green, is a fascinating and well-written, and I would argue very important book. It goes from wrong turns to opportunities, from the froth of bubbles innovation to the sour popping of bubbles, from the market for lemons to no market for lemons, from the great moderation to the moderation of great feelings. And I think throughout the book, the authors argue for a very compelling narrative of history and ideas, and some wise, although not always entirely wise, solutions. But let me start, Matthew, if I might, with the wrong turns. One of the things I found most interesting about the book and your thesis was your link between bubbles and financial innovation. Could you explain why, and can we really have the financial innovation without the bubbles? What's the big idea?
Well, I think you're right, that actually the reason we started to write the book was that we had, particularly I had at The Economist, been a great enthusiast in many ways for financial innovation. And I very much bought into the idea that the world was becoming a safer place because of some of the financial theories that had come out in terms of how derivatives and other securitization operates. And I remember being at the World Economic Forum in Davos in January of 2007, and I moderated a session of financial regulators and leading financiers at the time, and the general sense in the room was actually the world is a much safer place financially than it's ever been because of financial innovation. And yet it all went desperately pear-shaped. So no one, I mean, I defy anyone to say that they predicted the extent of the collapse of the financial system that took place in September 2008. And as that collapse happened, it just forced me back to asking, why did it all go wrong? How much of that theory about financial innovation could survive a crisis like that, where the government had to come in and rescue the day? And how much of it could we retain? How much of it did we have to jettison? What lessons could be learned? And the book is really about that. But one of the things that we did was to look back at previous crises, previous bubbles, all the way back to tulip mania in Holland in the early 17th century, where you had this extraordinary bubble in tulip bulb prices as people speculated over which color and variety of plant would emerge from different bulbs. And it seems that almost every major bubble that you find in history it's a combination of some kind of innovation that's happened, often a financial innovation. So tulip mania coincided with the development of modern futures markets. South Sea bubble a century later, the development of the stock market. The law bubble at the same time was around the development of credit markets. All the way through to, the 1929 stock market crash followed a bubble which really followed the development of mass market financial brokerage and the public getting involved in trading market shares for the first time. And throughout history, there seems to be this connection between innovation and bubbles, that somehow we recognize as the public that something good has happened, but we get carried away because we don't really have the tools, the equipment to judge how good that innovation has been. And there just tends to be various crowd factors that start working, and eventually we get carried away, and the bubble works. The bubble emerges through either misbehavior or through irrational exuberance, as Alan Greenspan put it, and things collapse. And then the challenge is really, how do you, after the bubble has burst, how much of what went on, how much of that innovation do you keep, and how much of it do you jettison. And the example we talk about in the book that I like most is back in 1720 when the South Sea bubble happened in London and the law bubble or Mississippi bubble happened in France at the same time. The British reacted to the South Sea bubble bursting by throwing a few directors of the South Sea Company in jail and making some rather modest adjustments to regulation, but basically allowing London to carry on as a centre of financial activity. The French basically abandoned paper money and abandoned the debt markets for, some would say forever, but in the latter case, but certainly they went into a major financial crisis during the 18th century, which ultimately culminated in the French Revolution. And so how you react to these crises and what part of the innovation you keep and what part you jettison is a key challenge. And I think as we look today at the debate about financial innovation, where you have someone like Paul Volcker or Joe Stiglitz say that basically the only useful financial innovation in the last 30 years has been the ATM machine. I think you do have a current out there that says all this financial innovation of the last 30 years was a waste of time, and we ought to go back to the regime that existed, like Glass-Steagall and so forth, beforehand.
Let me pick up on that point, linking, let's say, Senator Dodd to Robespierre, if I can follow up on your analogy. So one wrong turn that you identify in the book is much what you just said, of rushing into more regulation of financial markets without proper analysis of what happened, the proverbial throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Does the Dodd bill that's sitting in the Congress right now fall into this trap?
Well, I think one of the first versions of the bill, probably in the House rather than the Senate, actually had, after a whole series of proposals that were voted on, proposal number 90 whatever, set up a commission of inquiry to find out what went wrong, which I thought was a classic illustration of that sort of thinking. I think there's been more time to consider what went wrong because it's taken so long, in a way, to get to this point of actually having legislation that will probably be passed in the next few months. And there's been some improvement. But I still see that whole process of being more about the politics of appearance to be acting rather than serious considered reform. That someone like Dodd was one of the most, in my view, most corrupted politicians of the pre-bubble, the pre-crash era. He took special termed mortgages from Countrywide, mortgage, VIP, friends of Angelo Mazzillo, the chief executive's mortgage, massive recipient of campaign finance money, to such an extent that he's stepping down from the Senate, and he's desperate to kind of leave with a reputation somewhat salvaged. At the same time, I think Wall Street has not engaged constructively at all in the debate about how to reform capitalism and how it's regulated, that instead of recognizing that some things had gone badly wrong in the model, they just seem to have been committed to resisting at all cost any attempt to improve regulation. So, I think in the end, what we're getting is more the result of the necessity of politics, with the awareness that the midterm elections are coming up, and it was no coincidence that after the Democrats lost the Senate seat in Massachusetts, that they immediately wheeled out Paul Volcker, who'd been in hiding or banished to some cave somewhere for a year by the Democrats. Suddenly was back centre stage with the Volcker rule. And I think that was all about politics and the need to be seen to be getting tough on Wall Street rather than serious considered reform.
What you said just now makes me think of the dichotomy that's going on in the political process. I mean, is the choice that we're being offered, should it really be between unfettered capitalism on the one hand and bludgeoning capitalism on the other? In your view, and in the view you express in the book, how can we get better capitalist financiers, and I would add regulators?
I mean, one of the things that's really struck me in some of the reviews, particularly from conservative publications, has been that they've reacted as if any proposal to actually change the regulation of capitalism is uncapitalist, that it's an outrage that I would dare suggest that we need to improve corporate governance or something and give shareholders greater power to elect boards, that somehow that's uncapitalistic. I think there was this caricature of capitalism that bore little relation to the reality. history, I think, shows us that capitalism thrives best when there are good regulations in place and that government is playing a constructive role. And I think some people on the right want to go back to a view of capitalism which is no government whatsoever.